Okay, welcome back to another video. In this video, I'll show you guys how to comp land and homes. So we'll start with this subject property. This is a piece of land that I was already got under contract just the other day, and I'll show you guys how I was able to come up with the MAO supported by the comps. So first thing I like to do when I, look at a piece of property is I always want to look at where it's at, right? So I always open up the maps, look at where it's at, make sure I got a good idea of where either the home or the land is located at. Another thing I always want to do is, especially if it's land, it's kind of just look around, look at the neighborhood, see if it's even worth the deal, right? 'Cause sometimes these lands can be in the middle out of nowhere, and it doesn't make sense. So this here in this case is in a really great neighborhood, so it should sell. All right. So first thing I'll do now is then I'll put in the zip code so we can narrow in the search. Right after narrowing the search, we want to filter this for sold. Right, we only look at sold properties, not listed properties. And then we also want to filter these out and put these for homes. So that's the only thing we're looking at. Another thing is we want to make sure we're as close as possible to the subject property. As we've seen before, I believe subject property is right here. So the subject property is right here. So you want to pull comps as close as possible as you can to the subject property. So we'll look at this here, right? I mean, this is a 3-bedroom, 3-bath, just roughly around the same square footage as the subject property, a little bit bigger actually. But we'll see here that it's sold for $475, right? So we have an indication that homes in that area are selling for, or new construction homes are roughly selling for $475, and typically you want to get about 2 to 3 of these homes, right? This one being in this case is a little bit bigger, but it's sold for $574. And then you want to get a few more. Typically you want to find ones that are closer to this one, just because, right? I mean, you got to understand it's not really a big lot, and 9 times out of 10 you're not building these big custom homes on that lot, right? You want to build something that's proportionate to the neighborhood. So just keep looking, seeing if you could find a little bit more. This one is somewhat similar to the neighborhood, roughly around the same square footage. I believe subject property is 0.2 acres, comes out to about 87,000. And this home was sold for 385,000. All right, and then we'll look at another one. Similar situation, sold for almost 390. And then we'll look at another one. Similar situation, sold for 350. Right, so these right here are pretty much good bases of what the comps would go for. This right here, right, I mean, if it's realistically speaking, I think the highest you could potentially get for it would be 475. So typically the range for homes like this would be roughly around, I want to say 350 to 475, right, within that range. Typically I like to anchor my offers within the lowest offer, right? Because 9 times out of 10 you want to give yourself a little bit of room when you're negotiating, and also when you're selling the home. In this case, the seller was already low enough that I didn't have to negotiate much, but I'll show you guys how you can come up with that offer, and kind of how to anchor that offer so you're not necessarily going over your MAO. So we're looking at it here. We see that the lowest home sold for 350,000, with the highest being 475. Right, so typically you want to average it out. Like I said, I typically run numbers between the average, right? Just looking at the square footage per lot, right? I want to find the average square foot per lot for all 3 of these homes, and then I want to times it by the subject property square foot per lot, and then from there we can kind of decide on how much the home would sell for. In this case, since I've already done that, realistically speaking, the home could potentially sell for around 360, 370, right? And most builders typically want to pay 15% of ARV, right? So if we do the math, right, and I'll say the home would sell for 360, and we take 15% of that, well, that leaves our MAO at $54,000, right? Typically, that's what we could sell it to an end buyer for. Um, so consider you want to be lower than 54,000, right? The lower the better, obviously. In this case, I was able to get the property for 43,000, leaving me with a 10K spread. Now, here's another thing, right? Typically, in some areas, especially for land, I kind of want to look at what's for sale as well, right? Obviously, you're not necessarily running numbers based on this, but it kind of gives you an idea of how much properties are selling for near that area, right? So in this case here, you kind of see, they're going for 500,000, mid 400s, low 400s, and some of these homes, like I said, are kind of in similar square foot. Obviously, these being a lot bigger than subject property. But I typically want to look at these, kind of seeing if we're somewhat close to our ARV. In this case, being I think we had it at around 360. I believe we kind of got our MAO on 350. And again, another thing is you always want to be conservative when you look at MAO, right? You never want to overshoot it. It's better to undershoot it. That way, when you go to resell it, like I said, you have a little bit more wiggle room, a little bit more leverage. In this case here, we have a lot of leverage. I think we got it for 43. Like I said, worst case scenario, we could sell it for 53, 54. We're hoping to possibly get something within that 60-ish range, and hopefully make a nice assignment fee on it. But typically, that's how you run comps for land, right? So you always want to look at square footage. You want to make sure you're not looking at homes kind of like these, right? Custom built homes, something that necessarily wouldn't even fit on that lot. And you want to make sure it's realistic to, the type of home that's going to be built on the lot. If you have any questions in regards to how to run comps on land, feel free to give me a comment. If you have any questions on, how to run numbers, again, like I said, it's typical, standard is straightforward. And essentially the best way to run land comps is with new builds. Obviously, there's another thing I also want to show you guys. Is you could also run it through lots sold, right? In this case, there isn't really much lots that have sold in that area, which is why it makes it a little bit hard. And you never want to base your numbers on what lots have sold, just because it's sometimes some of these lots sit on market for hundreds of days, right? So it could be, these sold maybe in a year or 6 months or 2 years, right? So you never want to base your numbers off lots sold. Preferably, if you could find new construction builds within the area, it makes it a whole lot easier. That way, to even get an MAO, in addition to the MAO, is also to getting it sold, right? So you're not kind of scourging around looking for buyers because you ran comps on land, and when you look at new construction builds, there isn't any in the area, right? So I always prefer to use new construction builds. That way you can kind of get an accurate offer and also gauge if it's even if builders are even buying in that area. But yeah,